or everremodeling.com.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning on Chicago's Morning Answer. So we close out LGBTQIA2S plus month last week, as we did. I thought this was a useful rhetorical flourish to highlight a couple of underlying points. This is at a Denver Pride concert/rally last week. The drag queen in question is a guy who goes by the name Patagonia. See what he did there? He is I think he's a National Park Service ranger. He's dressed up like one on his social media posts. Dressed up like a woman, but in a park ranger's outfit with the short shorts, sort of like Lieutenant Dangle from Reno 911. But he's pretending to be a woman, mustache. Doesn't matter. This is what he had to say to close out the month.
And dear Trump, because we know you're going to listen to this later, we have a little message for you. Because the muzzle doesn't work on us. Climate change is real. Pride is a protest. Protect the dogs. Black lives still matter. No one is illegal on stolen land. And free Palestine! I guess it's better to be a than a fascist.
You go, girl. Okay. Well, it turns out that the science and the law has caught up with people like Patagonia, who would advocate for the mutilation of kids. Let's just be straight about it. No pun intended. MIT professor Alex Byrne, writing in the Washington Post on the science. In May, the Department of Health and Human Services published a comprehensive review of treatments for gender dysphoria in minors that was swiftly criticized in part because the names of its authors were withheld. I'm one of the authors. The review wasn't written by zealots busily grinding axes. In fact, liberals were in the majority. Some of us were paranoid that the White House would try to control the content of the review or even alter it pre-publication. That worry proved unfounded. I am hardly a fan of the current administration. I've never voted Republican. As an academic from Cambridge, Massachusetts, I hold many of the liberal beliefs of my tribe. That includes support for the right of transgender people to live free from discrimination and prejudice. But after surveying all the evidence and applying widely accepted principles of medical ethics, we found that medical transition for minors is not empirically or ethically justified. Oh, boy. I don't relish the hard looks that Alex Byrne is going to be getting on the campus of MIT and with her Ivy League colleagues in the weeks to come. But this is consistent with what the Cass report concluded in the UK. In the Supreme Court, in the Scrimeti case, caught up with the trans cult when it comes to the Constitution and the law. And as we talked about, declined to undermine a Tennessee law that prevented a girl from being transitioned, even with her parents' approval. For more on the particulars of that case, we're pleased to be joined by Richard Epstein, James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law, Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
So the importance of the case here, the Scrimeti case, is because it tackles and perhaps, and you could explain this, works around the balance between the interests of the child and parental authority. Did the court strike the right balance in the Scrimeti case?
Well, the first thing to understand about the case is it's only a partial issue, one on which the government position was very strong. The way this case is teed up is two ways. First, there are many people who insist that this is a matter of parental rights, having the right to control your children and decide medical decisions for them. That issue is nowhere in this particular case. What they did in the case was to say we're only going to evaluate an equal protection claim, which means that the treatment of trans children is somehow or other a suspect classification and therefore has to have heightened scrutiny. And what happens is you just can't make that case out. When you start with medicine, the argument was, well, you're willing to give testosterone to a boy who needs it in order to reach manhood, and so therefore you cannot stop giving testosterone to a girl who wants to transition from one state to another. But if you start looking at FDA rules and indeed sound medical practices, what you have to do is to ask whether or not the identical treatment, so-called, has identical consequences for the two sexes. And as you just mentioned from the MIT report and from the Cass report and from the really powerful stuff that was particularly put into evidence by the Alabama brief, which was extraordinarily powerful on this point, it's just not true. The risks themselves are much greater in the one case than they are in the other. And so Andrew Sullivan, in a nice line about this, said, is a parent is not allowed to give consent to have their child get tattooed before the age of 18. Are you going to treat the consent as that particular issue as decisive? And the argument the other way is really extremely strong. People claim that X, Y, and Z has gender dysphoria. Nobody's really quite sure of what the diagnosis is because children who have one kind of difficulty often have large numbers of other difficulties, and some of them they quote-unquote grow out of. And so the argument here is if you want to make a decision which is permanent and irreversible in many cases, don't do it at 17. Wait till you're 19 or 20 when you could do it as an adult. And if you actually look at those rules and you try to figure out what transitions are, it turns out it's not that easy to get a transition because the physician groups that are involved with all of these things want to make sure that you are in some sense a suitable subject for the kind of treatment that you're going to get. So there are a barrage of psychological tests, physical tests, and so forth. And oddly enough, when you get to the minor space, people seem to say you could get it on demand by a doctor who counsels you, who's also the same doctor who is going to do the particular treatment, or a member of the society which is strongly in favor of them. So the dissenting position, which says unlike cases should be treated alike, on the Equal Protection Clause, I think is really quite indefensible. The majority, I think, should have just faced it straight on, saying these are not like risks, and so therefore you don't have to give them the same treatment. It has nothing to do with the Equal Protection Clause. It has to do with the fact of massive hormonal differences between men and women, which are put there for one very simple reason. If the two sexes blurred and they got messy and there were all sorts of intermediate cases, reproduction could not take place. The only reason the system works is that men are men and women are women. And if you tried to shade it, it's like saying, well, we don't have right lines down the middle of the highway for any good reason. So if somebody wants to drive north on the right side of the street or right on the left side of the street, let them do it. And then everybody else crashes.
Well, I know
dichotomies are extremely important for reproduction, and this whole ideological movement essentially seems to want to deny that a truth. Now, as adults, it's not a question of reproduction. It's gone if you take this. The question is really whether or not you allow autonomous individuals. And I'm sort of in the libertarian camp on this issue, and I'm not aware of anybody who's opposed to gender assignment surgeries for minors or who don't want men to swim in women's athletic events and so forth, who wants to say that when you get to be your adult, you can't make your choices. And let me be even more emphatic about that. These choices are very difficult. If you actually check the records, for example, on the military side, people with trans background generally have more complications than people who are not because you've gone through so much more by way of surgery. But my view is that the president is completely wrong when he says, I'm going to take these people, just throw them out of the system. I think what you have to do is to take them in and to recognize that if you use neutral medical criteria to say who is and who is not fit to service, more transgender people will find it difficult to satisfy those requirements because they have more complex health history.
Well, I mean,
but we don't want to basically demonize people. We want to protect children.
No, we don't want to demonize people, but just like we can say if you don't meet the physical requirements or you have a criminal history, we can exclude you from the military. There's no constitutional right to be a member of the military. That's a privilege.
Yeah, but we don't want to exclude categorically people in this situation. There's just no reason to do so. You're talking about 5,000 or 6,000 people in many of these cases. Most of them are perfectly able to do their job. And you would say the following thing: if you've managed to stay in the military for 6 or 7 or 8 years and have discharged your duties, then the probability of you having a high risk is very, very low, because people with high risk tend to either not pass the entry test or wash out from the services very early on. And so on the one hand is you want to make sure that you have only narrow justifications for what you're doing, but when those apply them. But when they don't apply, do otherwise. So I'm strongly opposed to the Trump categorical ban because I think it's utterly inconsistent with the notion that people have a right to choose their own sexual identities at a certain point of time. Now, there are always social considerations, and people are always worried about what's going to happen to the population. And I think the answer is, in this particular case, there are thousands of other ways to increase reproductive rates, so you don't have to hit very hard on people who don't want to have children because they're trans, any more than you hit on people who are normal couples who want to be dinks, 2 incomes and no children. So I think the issue, in fact, is relatively straightforward and should be regarded as such. And let me mention one other thing about your Denver speech, which I think has really explained the decline of the gay rights movement as it gets permutated. It used to be a right for equal marriage equality. I have no particular problems with any of these issues. They're conventional, but I can certainly think it's fine. But when they start saying free Palestine is now the same thing, what happens is they make the fatal mistake. And they take a very narrow issue and they put it as part of an entire huge panoply of other issues which are unrelated. So it turns out that if you want to be for gay rights, you have to be for free
sure. This is
or something.
Yeah,
of the sort.
this
That's
is
extremely dangerous in the terms of the way in which the American political alliances have to be. I've been reading and doing a lot of work on climate change lately, and the most characteristic situation is instead of just talking about is it or is it not a function of carbon dioxide, we're told that the capitalist system and its massive inequalities is the same issue as we're talking about here. And to be opposed to climate change is to be opposed to the oppression of all people. And that, again, links to things that are unrelated. And you have to face the science on its own issue.
Well, but that's what. Wait.
There was this recent case called Mahmoud. Are you aware of that one?
Well, yeah, but hold on. I mean, but that's what the left does.
There are a large number of families, all diverse, who told the Montgomery School Board, we do not want our children to be exposed to the program of gay literature that you put into schools. You gave us an opt-out one time, and now you've taken it away. And so what's interesting about it is the sense that it's just mere exposure, not indoctrination, which is, I think, just false. But the interesting thing, if you tried to say, we want to expose these young children to Christian or Jewish ethics, and we're going to have books that highlight those things, including saying our religion only allows for sex between man and women and only for the purposes of procreation, that would be an establishment of religion. And so what you do is you could put one view in as privileged, and you can't talk in the opposite view. And the idea that it's, quote, mere exposure strikes me as being almost farcical given the way it's done. And you talk about this as a democratic process. If a school board is elected by 14% of the population, all of which are on the hard left, it can't really be a serious issue. So parental rights, I mean, are snubbed by the left in some cases, and they're championed by the left in the other cases. My view is you have to have a balanced approach and give the same situation. And the basic rule is parents get to control the education of their children until they engage in practices that would be called abuse or neglect, not feeding a child or beating them because they don't have the right religious beliefs. We put the limit on that, and that essentially is the effort to try to figure out what's the area of parental control and what not. And at least in one of the cases in Scrimeti, it was a girl who wanted feminine hormones. And so I don't even see why the case was there. So this is a very strange issue, but I'm afraid that too many people who are confusing it with too many other things instead of facing it. And the quote you gave from that fellow woman, I guess it was at MIT, was right. I've looked at the evidence. It's not close on this particular point.
Well,
it's just a matter of having these the World Gender Association and so forth. I think they're just a propaganda organization, and one has to take very strong steps to oppose them. The medical profession could become politicized just the way the legal profession.
It already has been. I mean, to a great extent, and of course, you've got a lot of treatises on the ideological bent of medical schools, which presents a problem too. Now, maybe that's receding a bit given some recent Supreme Court decisions, as well as the Trump administration's posture towards the towards DEI and the whole panoply of identitarian politics on the left. I mean, the speech from that dude where he ran down the list of all the positions you have to take, of course, because everything is in service to the solidarity and marginality political agenda of the left. So that's why parental rights works sometimes and it doesn't work other times, because it's all in service of this ideological agenda.
I mean, it's very powerful, and it's too powerful, but they're on the wrong side of an 80-20 issue. And, look, I'm very opposed to what Donald Trump is trying to do to universities, particularly with basic research and immigrants coming from overseas to study here. But as an alumnus of Columbia College, I'm appalled at many of the things that the college has done. And I realize once it's entrenched, it's very, very difficult to take it out. And I think the kind of response that I have is perfectly appropriate. The kind of response that Trump has is not. And I'm told the news is that at this point, Harvard is taking people off its wait list, which it never used to have to do. And why is that? Because there's a real uneasiness about the way in which the institution has situated itself. And it's not as bad as it was under Claudine Gay. And in fact, there may be great progress. But what happens is the perception is out there. And I don't think that they or Columbia can do anything to shake the image unless they take some very emphatic step publicly to repudiate some of the policies that got them into these kinds of problems. And so, I received the greatest education imaginable at Columbia College from 1960 to 1964. And, 15 years ago, I stopped giving to Columbia College because I did not think they were giving the kind of education that helped me so much, because they were too political. And they didn't spend any time trying to figure out why it is that your favorite hobby horse may in fact be wrong. Self-examination is, I think, the lesson I learned most. And whenever I sit down and I write something, I have a couple of rules. One is that I try to cross-examine myself with the strongest arguments that I can. And second is, anything I wrote more than 5 years ago, I like to treat as though it were written by a stranger, and then see whether or not I still believe it on independent ground. And I think that kind of self-examination is really required. And when you listen to that speech from Denver, that was not a man who was reflective. It was a man who was angry.
Yeah, well, we got all kinds of that on the left, and that's not a bug, that's a feature. Professor Richard Epstein, James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thank you as always.
Always a pleasure. Bye-bye.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
The more you listen, the more you'll know. This is Chicago's Morning Answer. Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
We couldn't decide if we needed in-home care for Dad.
Right. Just some help here and there with bathing, organizing his meds, a walk through the neighborhood.
Oh, exactly. But everywhere we looked, we had a 4-hour minimum. It was more care than he needed. And it didn't make sense to spend extra for it.
Then we found Senior Helpers of Neighborhood